Okay, so here's part two of that discussion, and it's kind of all over the place because I'm just kind of throwing stuff out there. But I want to do a little Baptist history here, just so you know where the Baptists fit in to the Calvin or Arminian discussion. So there are two views, actually there's three views of Baptist origins. One I'm going to discount outright. There was a move in the 1800s called landmarkism, which I despise. And it was basically, part of it was an attempt to show why the Baptist denomination is the one true denomination. And this view traced Baptist churches all the way back to John the Baptist. All right. If you ever get hold of The Trail of Blood by B.H. Carroll, go ahead and do it. It's terrible scholarship. And I don't want to get it. If you want to get into that, go into Baptist history. I don't feel like dealing with it. Let me just say, overall, it's a very unscholarly view that does not carry water. Reject it. The other two views are the Anabaptist view and the English separatist view. Everyone agrees that Calvinist Baptists come out of English separatists, 1640s. Some people suggest, though, that General Baptists or Arminian Baptists come from the Anabaptist movement. I do not agree with that. Tom Nettles, who would be the preeminent Southern Baptist historian, does not hold that view. I would say probably 75% to 95% of all Baptist scholars do not hold that view. There are a couple that do. Paige Patterson is one. I think Emer Caner is another one. I personally think that it is a romantic view that people want to be associated with the Anabaptists because they got tortured and beat continually. And I think there's something to be said for people that are like, my ancestors were tortured for the faith. Anabaptists come ultimately out of Ulrich Zwingli's Zurich. So you've read about Zwingli, you've read about some Anabaptists, but the Anabaptist movement breaks away from Zwingli, and it also rises up kind of all over Germany at the same time. It's largely from people reading the Bible on their own, but the main thing that makes an Anabaptist is the view that infants should not be baptized. That is a very Baptist view. There are other views, though, that Anabaptists hold that do not line up with Baptist views. Anabaptists are almost 100% pacifists. There's a few examples where they're not, but it's very rare. Anabaptists take the Sermon on the Mount literally. So you do not take oaths. You can't swear oaths at all. That's where they get their pacifism from, with turning the other cheek, all of that. Baptists have never held those views. So the first real Baptist is a guy by the name of John Smith in the early 1600s. And he baptizes himself. He is Arminian, and he has contact with Mennonites who are Anabaptists. The Mennonites and the Amish, well, the Mennonites are our main branch of Anabaptists still around today. The Amish are an offshoot of them. Hutterites, they're Anabaptists as well. So Paige Patterson, for example, believes that John Smith or John Smythe's connection with the Anabaptists is how we draw our genetic connection back to the Anabaptists in 1525. But this is the analogy that he uses. He says, Paige Patterson's a Texan, likes horses and cowboys and all that. And he says, if you are tracking a horse, all right, and you follow its hoof prints, and it leads to a stream, and it gets into the stream, and it doesn't come out on the other side, what would you think? Well, you would think that the horse walked downstream. So you would walk downstream, and if at some point you see a set of hoof prints coming out on the other side of the stream, you would assume this is the same horse I was tracking. He went into the stream, walked downstream, and came out on the other side. All right, so it is not a true connection. Again, I don't agree with that because you cannot draw the genetic connection. You cannot say, here's where they connect. You can just say, here are the Mennonites, here's John Smith. John Smith is bringing in English separatist views because he comes from England. He leaves England and goes to the Netherlands for religious freedom. And that's where their little group there decide that to baptize themselves and reject infant baptism. The Mennonites had already done that, but they do not come from Anabaptists. They might be influenced by the Mennonites in some degree. The Calvinist Baptists, nobody questions they come in the 1640s in England. That's a very clear genetic connection there. So I do not think that we have Anabaptist origins if you're Baptist. Some people do. Regardless, in the early 1600s, you have Arminian Baptists, and by 1640, you have Calvinist Baptists. So both of these views have been in Baptist theological circles for 400 years. So when people talk about Calvinism, that's not a Baptist thing. Well, it is, right? Just depends on what kind of Baptist you are. So again, this is from a question by Matt in your class who... if I show this video in future lectures, then future classes, then it's not your class, but you get it. So when he said, hey, I'm reading about Luther and Calvin, and some people are telling me to avoid this Calvinism stuff. No. If you're Baptist, some Baptists are Calvinists, some are not. That's perfectly fine. I did reference before that if you have Reformed Baptist churches, of which there are Southern Baptist churches, they are Calvinist. I do not know of any Southern Baptist churches that are pure Arminian. Those would be Free Will Baptist churches. So right down the street from me, there's a Free Will Baptist church. They are clearly Arminian in their theology. They would hold to the 5 points of Arminianism. So you might have some Baptists that hold to Arminian views, but I don't know any church that is clearly, we are Arminian within the Southern Baptist Convention. There are some that are very clearly Calvinist. So I mentioned in the last little video why you're seeing a resurgence in Calvinism. And I have a theory on this. I haven't studied this in detail, so if you find information that says otherwise, if it has good sources, go for it. This is just my thinking. In the early 1800s was the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was very Arminian. It was very emotional. You will tend to notice Calvinism focuses or tends to be much more intellectual and unemotional. Arminianism usually seems to be much more emotional. So you will have in the Second Great Awakening, it's much more emotional. Many churches today, Southern Baptist churches, were influenced by the Second Great Awakening. And I think in a lot of ways it's bad Baptist ecclesiology. If you study, and that's a paper you can write on, right? Compare ecclesiologies, how the church works. From the very beginning, what made Baptists were the rejection of infant baptism and the belief that the church is only made up of Christians. It goes together. If you baptize infants, they're part of the church. Well, what happens if they grow up and they're not saved? You have somebody in the church that is not saved. All right? Catholics believe that. True Presbyterians believe that. The old school Congregationalists, which don't exist anymore, believe that. They're like, well, this person's in the church, but they're not a Christian. Why? Well, because their view of church was that you're baptized, you are part of the group of believers. You might not be a believer, but you're raised in that, even though it doesn't save you. For Baptists, they're like, well, that doesn't make sense because the church is supposed to be made up of believers. Therefore, how do we know who's a believer? Well, they have to profess their belief and then they get baptized. That's the movement. Once you're baptized, you are now a part of the church. You have children that are in the church, but they're not part of the church till they're baptized. So a true Baptist church, if we go true to our ecclesiology, is made up only of believers. Now, that doesn't mean that non-believers can't come, but the purpose of church is for the believer. So, in an old school Baptist church, 1600s, 1700s, the idea that you would have emotional songs at the end of the service and an evangelistic plea doesn't make any sense because everybody that's in the church is saved. And if an unsaved person is there, well, then you go share the gospel with them, right? But the purpose of church is not to save people. The purpose of church is for the believers, and then believers fulfill the Great Commission by preaching the gospel to other people who then get saved and become part of the church. In the early 1800s, you have a movement especially wrapped up in a guy by the name of Charles Finney. Charles Finney was a fantastic evangelist, but his ecclesiology and theology is a little bit off. So Finney believed, he was a lawyer by trade, he got saved, and he believed that we need to get people to accept Christ, and we can use almost by whatever means necessary. We're not talking old school Charlemagne, just baptize everybody, defeat the Saxons and baptize them, now you're Christians. But Finney came up with the idea in the early 1800s that we're going to have a church service late at night. We are going to play emotional music, going to keep the lights dark. We're going to have benches in the front for people to pray, called the anxious bench. And we're going to preach the gospel. And if you're feeling convicted, come up to the front and we're going to be praying for you. And Finney's idea was, if we can put enough pressure on the person, they'll break. So if we can create the right environment and the right formula, we can cause them to become Christians. That's an extremely Arminian view. But where's the Holy Spirit in that? A Calvinist view would be, you preach the gospel, they accept it or not. It's not on me, it's on the Holy Spirit. It doesn't mean you don't try to be winsome or whatever. But if Finney's views sound familiar to you, that's because his views, and Finney was not, he was, I think, Presbyterian, but he was very unorthodox in his Presbyterianism. But if that sounds familiar to you, you're like, hey, that's like a Baptist revival service. Exactly. And it's a lot of what regular Baptist services are like. So again, I'm always, when I get in my Baptist history class, I had a student 2 years ago, he said, well, if Baptist churches are only supposed to be made up of believers, why do we have altar calls all the time? I'm like, exactly. Now, again, I'm not against an altar call, but I think a lot of people think the role of church is to save people. That's not the role of the church. I mean, it is, but a church service is for the believer. Now, you can have evangelistic services, but it's to build up the body. The body is built up. They go live out their Christian life. Then they carry out the Great Commission. People get saved. They come to the church. They get baptized, and they're now part of the church. That's how Baptist churches are supposed to work. So anyway, so just keep that in mind. Again, not against an altar call, but the whole idea of an altar call really doesn't make a lot of sense in a Baptist church unless you're specifically having an evangelistic service. My church in North Carolina, which was Southern Baptist, at the end of the service, our pastor would say, if you're here and you have any questions about these things, come up and talk to us afterwards. And then every January, we would have a whole month of evangelistic sermons and services where the goal was bring your unsaved friends to hear the gospel, but the rest of the time it's on us. It's on the individual Christians to live their life as a Christian, to share the gospel with people, and then once those people get saved, bring them into the church. So anyway, so beginning in the 1800s, Baptist churches became much more emotional, much more Arminian. And the problem with that is it did not have a good doctrinal depth. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind is you always want to keep your doctrine and practice orthodox and biblical. You have to have proper doctrine to lead to proper practice. If you have practice without doctrine, it will eventually get wonky. If you have doctrine without practice, it will become stiff and legalistic. And throughout all of church history, this has been a struggle, right? It has always been a struggle. So in the 1800s, it became incredibly emotional. And then in the 1900s, they're kind of living on this emotional view of Christianity. Well, yeah, I was baptized. I mean, you can see the remnant of this today in the South. The South is the Bible Belt. You have all these people that claim to be Christians, and they have no discipleship. They might not even have been to church in 20 years. They probably have very bad theology, and you're like, well, how did that happen? It happened from a church mindset where we are focusing on these externals of, you need to be born again, you need to be saved, come down and you're baptized, hooray, you're saved, you can't lose your salvation, now go and keep sinning just like you did before, and there's no expectations, right? That was never taught that way, but that's functionally what happened. And so when 1960s hit, the bottom falls out. Right? Because in a sense, the protesters of the 60s correctly recognized that their parents or whoever, these Christians, we're not really living out a Christian life. The fact that you can justify legalized racism and is really difficult to mesh with the Bible, right? I mean, when you and I read the Bible, the idea of racism is non-existent. Now, there's slavery in the Bible, but it's not race-based slavery. This is old school, you lost in battle, you're a slave. This is old school, I'm in debt, I become a slave. It was never, you look different, you're a slave. And yet when slavery turned into that, and you started to have, the Mexicans, when you had the conquistadors came over, when you had slave traders go to Africa, and you had the black people that were becoming enslaved, that is never condoned in the Bible. And the fact that you could institutionalize this into society was hypocritical. I mean, in the South, we have Jim Crow laws, and here everybody's a Christian. And a lot of people that came after this saw a lot of the hypocrisy. And then what happened was they correctly analyzed the problem, they went to the wrong solutions. So after that, you have a lot of people that are leaving the church, which you still see today. And I would say they're not true believers, right? If you leave the church, I would say you're not saved. And what you have then is you have a return to doctrine to build up a good system that involves discipleship. Discipleship was lacking for a good 100 years. So I really think 70s and 80s, you start to see this turn back towards doctrine. And so ever since then, you've had this increase in Reformed theology, which is very doctrinally thick. So anyway, that's why I think you're seeing this movement. And I think it's good. I think we need to continue to have solid theological discussions that build up the faith and help to disciple other people so the church is stronger. So in terms of numbers, the church is smaller, but it's much healthier. So I'm just babbling at this point. That's basic Baptist babbling that I'm giving you there. And hopefully that helps. If not, just delete the video and you're no worse for wear, except you just lost 17 minutes of your life. So anyway, yeah, I'm really behind it. I'm grading all sorts of online papers, and I'll be grading them until early next week. But that's good because we have a discussion board this week. So anyway, if any of these ideas interest you, feel free to write a paper on these, right? Just let me know. We can narrow down a topic to where it's something you can research. But again, Calvinism, Arminianism is I think it's a healthy discussion. It can become unhealthy. All right. You'll have people that's all they think about, right? And they become very, they put people off. I mean, I have known people, I like Calvinists, right? I'm pro-Calvinist, pro-Arminian, but I have lots of Calvinist friends, but then you always have some, you're like, oh my gosh, you make me want to hate Calvinists because they're so snooty and haughty and reduce everything to this belittling of every other view, right? That's not very Christian-like. And it's it turns a lot of people off. But I really think it's a good discussion to have. Baptism is a good discussion to have. Any of these things, if you're interested, let me know. We'll come up with a topic for you. So sorry to talk so long. Hope you have a good week. And I'll try to get these things posted.